It is Septuagesima Sunday, which was taken off the new calendar for some reason. We'll go over that here in a few minutes, but the reasoning behind that was, well, it takes emphasis away from Lent, when in reality, Septuagesima Sunday is when you start preparing for Lent. As the article we'll go over here in a few minutes describes it, in the athletic contest you participate in, it's a good idea to prepare for it before you engage in it. Do some training, stretch, whatever. Instead, weirdly, I think the removal of Septuagesima from the new calendar has helped de-emphasize Lent. It's hence why you get so much talk of giving up chocolate, which isn't that big of a deal for Lent unless you have some very disordered attachments to chocolate. And we'll go over that all in a moment. I want to give you a update on Francis. Vatican News posted this. Pope resting in hospital, tests show improvement. Holy See press office communicated journalists as Pope Francis's medical therapy has been slightly adjusted and tests show improvement in certain health parameters. He was admitted to Rome's Gemelli Hospital on Friday morning following a bout of bronchitis. I got a lot of pushback from people saying don't spread, false rumors. It was really X, Y, and Z. It's really all these really horrible things. Well, that's not what it looks like. It looks like he's recovering, just like the last 3 or 4 times he had this problem. Keep praying for him, regardless, in whatever way and for whatever intention your conscience tells you to. Just make sure it's for something generally positive that involves the salvation of his soul, please, at the very least. With that having been said, let's do the most awkward segue possible and start talking about the Francis's nuReligion, which a priest that I cover from time to time on this channel, a Austrian priest who is taking great risk telling the truth about things, has published a pair of articles, one very short, the other a little longer. The other one more appropriate, I think, for a Sunday in general. If you're relatively new to the channel, I do try to keep priests' letters and things to Saturdays and Sundays, especially. So here's the first of his letters. Marco Tossati, who's an Italian journalist with rather compelling connections into the Roman Curia. He gets a lot of early news stories. He was the first to publish the Vigano letters 7 years ago. He gives us the headline, The New Church of the New Pagans by Father Joachim Heimerl von Heimthal. And you're going to see him ask some very provocative questions. So let's just dive right into it. Let the priest speak for himself. Does the Catholic Church continue to exist? I was asked when I was studying the Catechismo, not only the called Catechismo Universal of Juan Pablo II, John Paul II, but also at the interior catechisms from the Roman Catechism of 1566 to the Catechism of Pope Pius XII of 1912. Certainly all catechisms represent the continuity of the faith and are able to present the deposit of the faith in its totality. For example, John Paul II also called his catechism a safe norm. However, the norms have gone out of fashion in our time. This is also valid for the norms of the faith, including the affirmations of the sacred writing. After all, the non-normed norm, they are now subject to contempt or arbitrary interpretation of people. According to the Catechism, they are named pastors and teachers of the church, as the Pope says with his bishops. Pius says he calls himself like this because he holds the mission commanded by Jesus Christ to teach the truth and divine truth to all people. Only from her do men receive the full and certain knowledge necessary to live in a Christian way. I'm going to pause here. Some of this translation is a little clunky because we're just using Google's extension. I did not run this through Grok, which I usually do. If these lines are applied as a safe norm to the pontificate of Pope Francis, it still seems to us, in the best of cases, a caricature of the one who was once Catholic. Below them and their followers, the teaching church does not serve the diffusion of divine truths and laws, up to error, confusion, and even apostasy. This has probably been demonstrated the best in light of the numerous examples of the introduction of the benediction for irregular and James Martin types, with which Francis and his prefect of the dicastery of the faith have fundamentally said goodbye to the norm of the divine law, to all the critics who follow it, meaning they've left the teaching of the church and the law of God behind on the James Martin sin. A church in which the personal acceptance of the James Martin sin has been converted into a factor of integration into the ecclesiastical hierarchy is certainly not the Catholic Church. And to a certain extent, it is not the Church of Christ. It is a diabolical monstrous that opposes the divine revelation. To say the least, rodeos, I'm guessing here he means apes, a James Martin church, which is as much a caricature of the Catholic Church as its own Francis. Basically, what he's saying here is that The new synodal church has a James Martin face. Like I had been saying before all the J.D. Vance news suddenly dominated the news. It says when we talk today about the Catholic Church, we're undoubtedly talking about a church that has experienced such a profound change that only one can talk about a lasting rupture with everything that has a Catholic character beyond the acronyms. Even more than in the establishment of the James Martin Church, this is manifested well in the systematic persecution of the traditional Latin religion and its followers. It is clear of all those who are truly Catholic. For the part of the Pope and his people, this happens with such pathological hatred that one is inclined to call this persecution diabolical. This is as much as it applies to the greatest sacred place for all Catholics, just the Santa Missa, meaning the Holy Mass. What is happening here was never dreamed of by any pope before Francis, certainly less so by Pius X when he wrote in the Catechism. However, Francis is only the extreme symptom of the decadence of the Catholic Church, and certainly he is a motor that has accelerated a process that has been underway for a long time, probably long before the last council. At this time, midway through the 50 years, the young Joseph Ratzinger wrote a spectacular essay on the new pagans of the Catholic Church. Ratzinger referred to the infidels who were in the post-war period and at the meeting of the affluent society formally joined the church, even though for a long time they had been replaced in their personal lives by their own idols. Therefore, there was reason, and yet Ratzinger himself would hardly have guessed at this moment, that these new pagans would seize the church and infiltrate completely into the clergy, even into the papacy. Like Pope, Ratzinger undoubtedly sought to possess the Desiderado. While he continued being a faithful servant and a collaborator of the truth, the dynamics of the new paganism passed through his pontificate and lifted Francis to the Holy See. In what other way could one describe a pope who publicly denies the only salvation through Jesus Christ if he is not like a new pagan? It is the disintegration of Catholicism. The characteristics of the new paganism have appeared from all sides. The church is not understood as a divine institution, and therefore, in the way described by all catechisms, even as a field of play for reform projects, supposedly that are the kicking off a new epoch. Francis applied the label of synodal church to this new Catholic Church and gave himself the same impression that it could change his old church. This has been seen in the ineffable example of the benedictions for the James Martin crowd, and Francis will also land a hand in other neurological points if Providence still allows it, meaning Francis will help guide changes in other areas of church morality and not just the benedictions for the James Martin crowd. You have no doubt that he will introduce female, quote, deacons in the opening of the acolyte, and the readership to lay people, females, clearly points in this direction. Of course, this detail also shows the end of Catholicism. The ministries that until the catechism of Pope Pius will soon function as demons and one day surely as priests, meaning he's talking here about deaconettes. The recipient reorganization of the ordained ministries, which is recognizable in the Pope's tactics, is a prerequisite for the persecution of the traditional mission. I say in another way, with the new female ministries and with the new Mass, we are also creating a new church. Pope Francis can make it to this church as synodal. He can do it no matter what it means. However, there's one thing you won't be. If you follow his new church, you won't be Catholic. And for this reason, it is enough to take a look at all the catechisms that have developed throughout the history of the church. Indeed, the Catholic Church is in the process of breaking the same advice. And with the violation of the Sacrament of Holy Orders, this Desiderado will be completed, meaning a sort of disintegration. Where this leads, you can now be seen, and Francis and his followers are demonstrating in every part. What the Church has always taught as divine truths and laws is not to be believed as its heritage. But in this way, the new Catholic Church has been converted not only into a neo-pagan church, but also into a church of arbitrariness, into a James Martin church, and at the same time, into a church of the Antichrist. So, yeah, appears that Father Heimerl does agree with Fulton Sheen, Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich, and those of us laity who point out the things that those figures said and how that sounds suspiciously like what we're living through in the Catholic Church today. Mike Rizzio says decadence is like the rot that takes down an apple in a day or two. It has to be cut out and sealed. Pretty much, it pretty much has to be essentially forcibly removed. It's sort of like what we're seeing going on in the secular realm with all this restructuring of the U.S. federal government at this point. There's decadence deeply cut into it. I think we've only seen this scratch the surface of it, and it's going to take essentially forcibly removing it and the pain that comes with that's going to have seismic consequences across the culture. But let's go back to Father Heimerl. He has a little more of an uplifting message here called the Message of the Grace of God in Lourdes. This was published a few days ago, kind of got lost in all the news with going on right now. He comments on Bernadette of Lourdes. and by Franz Werfel, which is a the song of Bernadette. So here's what he has to say. I think you might think about this as something positive to take with you to Mass today, before we pivot over to talking about Septuagesima Sunday a little bit. To this day, Franz Werfel's The Song of Bernadette is the best-selling German novel. 80 years ago, the unforgettable Hollywood film adaptation starred Jennifer Jones was released in cinemas and was crowned with 4 Oscars and 3 Golden Globes. The Song of Bernadette is Werfel's most personal work. He himself said that none of his books contained a more significant message than this novel, which is also a votive offering. Although he was of our elder brethren, Werfel wrote the text as a thank you for being rescued from the bad guys in Germany via Spain to the USA, thereby fulfilling a vow he had made while fleeing in Lourdes. Then as now, the small town in the Pyrenees is the most visited pilgrimage site in the world. Werfel's novel has long since become the international medium for the miracle of Lourdes. Remember, this is the book and the film that helped bring Lourdes to the attention of millions of people worldwide. This miracle begins on February 11th, 1858, at the Grotto of Masbiel. A beautiful lady appears to Bernadette Soubirous, the daughter of an impoverished miller. The radiant figure wears a white veil and a blue belt, and 2 golden roses are on her bare feet. She asks the girl to come to the grotto every day for 15 days. Despite the resistance of her parents, the church, and the authorities, Bernadette returns there every day. As the apparitions continue, the lady calls for the rosary to be prayed and for penance. She also wishes for a chapel to be built where people can go in processions. Under Bernadette's hands, she causes a spring to spring up in the grotto. Since then, countless people have found healing there. At the end of the 15 days, the lady finally reveals her name with the words, "I am the Immaculate Conception." She reveals herself as the Blessed Virgin Mary. From then on, the influx of pilgrims never stopped. After receiving ecclesiastical recognition, Bernadette entered the order and began her life as a monk in Nevers until she passed away early of bone tuberculosis and was canonized in 1933. What the apparition had promised her had come true. My child did not promise to make you happy in this world, but in the other. Against this background, the novel stands between the genres of Marian poetry and hagiography. Werfel himself emphasized above all that he wanted to portray the authentic events. At the same time, however, he focused on the socio-cultural conditions at the time of the apparitions. After all, the miracle of Lourdes occurs when people are moving full steam ahead into the modern age. Connection to the railway network is supposed to finally lead the city into the age of industrialization and global trade. For this reason, the apparitions are viewed skeptically as a step back into the pre-Enlightenment. They stand at odds with a capitalist, highly critical, and highly scientific age that is built on the ruins of faith, as the writer Hyacinthe de Lafitte, the only fictional character in the novel, puts it. Lafitte thus becomes a projection surface on which all the tendencies of modern skepticism, which tends to atheism and the idolization of man, are condensed. Werfel is convinced that all the inhuman horrors of the 20th century result from this attitude. Therefore, in Lafitte, he depicts a humanity twisted in on itself, which does not want to know God and only needs him all the more. For Lafitte, the miracle of Lourdes is at best a wonderful fairy tale that in its simplicity cannot compete with the highest art. He has long since replaced faith with the religiously exalted concept of art, crushing it between Darwinism and aestheticism. He sees man only as a driven object, as a miserable race of animals. But this path ultimately leads to nothing. In the end, all that remains for Lafitte is cynicism. Decades later, when he stood in front of the Grotto Masbiel, he realized this. He had long since failed as a writer, and once more had cancer in his body. He was now as close to his end as he was to despair, and only now did he judge himself. If I did not recognize God, it was only because I could not bear the fact that I was not him. Therefore, analysis was my world throne from which I ruled. My sin is the sin of Lucifer. It is clear that my arrogance destroyed me. Lafitte made himself the measure of all things. He followed the spirit of the times and ended up in godlessness. It seemed impossible to him that heaven could reveal itself. He just laughed at the apparition's request for prayer or penance. This was no different in the 19th century than it was in Werfel's time or today. People always think they know where things are going, in the church as well as in the world. No one takes God himself or heavenly apparitions seriously. Lafitte stands as a pars pro toto for a modern and, quote, radical nihilism that no longer sees man as God's image, but as an immoral machine in a completely meaningless world. Werfel opposes this mainstream with a spiritual principle, which he calls in a forward sketch the metaphysical religious conception of life. He is convinced that this cosmos was created by the spirit, and that spiritual meaning therefore flows through every atom. The novel is dedicated to this principle as a jubilant hymn, which Werfel describes as follows. A simple, lovely example shows how, in the midst of our skeptical age, divine powers work and raise an ignorant but brilliant creature far above the ordinary. Just as, according to a saying by St. Therese of Lisieux, everything is grace, so Bernadette is chosen by grace. What Werfel calls genius is nothing other than the unreserved affirmation of the divine will, which is man's highest calling. This is shown by the example of Mary as well as that of Bernadette. With a fiat mihi, she puts her life at the service of the gift she has received. Lafitte did not do this. He closed himself off to grace and limited himself to his own self. He is the opposite of Bernadette. He contrasts God's gracious affirmation with that Luciferian negation that carries with it the no of the whole world. Only when he hears the invocations in the litany of Loretto in front of the grotto does he realize that one cannot live without mercy, let alone die. He turns to the Blessed Virgin. Yes, you ivory tower, I too am a tower, but my tower is crumbling and full of rats and woodlice. Yes, you golden house, myself is also a house. It was rented to me. I have ruined it through and through. But now I have been given notice to vacate it with short notice, and I am being thrown out. I can't seem to put anything right anymore. Whoever welcomes Jesus, as Mary did at the Annunciation, becomes like her a golden house and attains the fullness of humanity. Only this means holiness in the true sense, and this is exactly what is shown in Bernadette, or in contrast in Lafitte. God has placed man, as Gardini says, in a fundamental relationship with himself, without which he can neither exist nor be understood. Man is a meaning that lies above him and only in God. Therefore, he cannot exist as a closed figure in himself, an isolated lovelessness like Lafitte, but only in a loving relationship, from God, towards God. However, this existential relationship is not something that comes second to the essence of man, so that he could also exist without it. On the contrary, only in this relationship is humanity founded. The Song of Bernadette is about this intersection of human nature and divine grace, and this is the message of this great novel. And he did this because the Feast of Lords was recently. That's why he covered this. And maybe you're not a book type, maybe you can't get a copy of the book on short notice, but you could probably find it if you're looking for something to watch after Mass that's fitting for a Sunday. Fitting for Septuagesima Sunday, as we'll talk about in a moment. You could find that film probably on almost any streaming service, either for free or for a couple of dollars to rent. So consider watching that today. All right, folks, let me take a look here in the live chat before we go over to one other thing. Only 44 likes is Joe. Yeah, Joe, please hit the like button. Even knock has been taken over, says Michael. Joe. Yeah, yes, that's true. Truly remarkable, by the way. If you go look at Fatima, if you go to the Shrine of Fatima, you'll see Rupnik art all over the place, and that they built a new basilica there for some reason, even though the other one wasn't really that old by European standards. And so it's really weird what they've done to Fatima, and broadly, it's almost like a good metaphor for what they've done to the Fatima message, which is to hide it away as best they can. Because I'm not one who thinks we ever got the Fatima message. I think what they gave us in 2000 was essentially fake. Anyway, let's go on to the other thing for today. Today is Septuagesima Sunday. This is a piece by Eric Sam. It was written 5 years ago for Septuagesima Sunday. This is the day where your conscious efforts to prepare for Lent should start, and it was stripped from the new calendar. I'll let Mr. Salmons explain this to you. He says, Sunday is Septuagesima Sunday, which begins the church's preparation for the Feast of Feasts, Easter. Septuagesima means it's the 70th, referring to the approximately 70 days before Easter. Each of the 3 weeks before Lent have similar names: Septuagesima, Sexagesima, and Quinquagesima. And the Latin term for Lent itself is Quadragesima, meaning the 40th. While not intending to be mathematically precise, these days represent a countdown, in a sense, to the celebration of the events of our Lord's Passion, Death, and Resurrection. Sadly, the Septuagesima season was removed from the post-Vatican II liturgical calendar. The reason given was a call to greater simplicity, which was supposed to re-emphasize the importance of Lent. Yet the very purpose of the Septuagesima season is to emphasize the importance of Lent. Instead of Lent sneaking up on us, we have a chance to prepare our hearts, minds, and bodies for the penances we will undertake during Lent. Vestments are violet, the Alleluias and Gloria are omitted from the liturgy, and the overall tone of the liturgy becomes more penitential. All these changes signal to us that the time for penance is at hand. Note that the Septuagesima presupposes that Lenten penances are hard. One does not need weeks to get ready to give up chocolate or stop putting cream in one's coffee. Yet true penances such as fasting and other serious physical privations do need preparation, thus the need for the Septuagesima season. Sunday's epistle emphasizes the importance of physical penances while also reminding us of the need to ask for God's grace when offering them. St. Paul writes that I, quote, chastise my body and bring it into subjection, lest perhaps when I have preached to others, I myself should become a castaway. See 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 27. The apostle sees the spiritual life as fundamentally a struggle. We must fight against both demonic forces as well as our own bodies if we are to advance in the spiritual life. And this battle is continual, not over until we reach union with God in heaven. St. John Chrysostom notes, this war admits of no truths, does it? As no set time for the assault, does it? Thus, Septuagesima begins the annual reminder that the Church gives us that we must continue the struggle, never surrendering to the passions that continually assail us. I'm not going to read the rest of it. It's not much left, but I will tell you this is a good time to start thinking about Lent, to start preparing. If you're starting to think about doing fasting, real fasting, like harder, old-fashioned fasting, then I can tell you from experience that does take some preparation. So perhaps you should start preparing for the fasting, because if you go from eating 3 times a day with your only not eating window, as they call it in diet circles, when you sleep at night and then the time it takes when you have to get up to get ready to eat breakfast, you're going to have a hard time. So you should probably start preparing for that in some way. And if it's not normal fasting, you're going to do something else for Lent to up things, you need to start preparing for it now. So I would suggest taking the micro season we're entering into, the preparation for Lent season, take it with some gravity. You never know when your Lenten season will be your final Lenten season. So please try to make the most of it. You want me to read Shakespeare here someday? No, that's not going to happen. That is not going to happen. I can barely read on camera as it is. Besides, I'm all congested, as you can hear. Even though I took Dayquil, it just always seems like it just stops working right before I go live. David Wilson says he started preparing 2 weeks ago. Very good. Very good. All right, folks. Please pray for Francis. As I started with this live stream, he is doing better. He seems to be improving. So, and keep praying whatever way your conscience directs you to pray for him. And I will remind you, also personal prayers. The road conditions in my area aren't super great, so we're going to see if getting to mass is even possible for us today. They dumped a bunch of snow and near where we're going, and so hooray. But anyway, folks, thanks very much for tuning in, and as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.